Hey, well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you this morning about agents becoming perhaps a little bit too involved in the transaction. We run into a situation, in fact, we've run into it a couple of times through this office, once quite some time ago and once quite recently. In both cases, very similar, where the sellers were going to be out of the country. And in both cases, the sellers instructed their agents, just sign on my behalf. Now, in one case, it was written by way of a text. In another case, it was verbal, but it was later ratified by action. But in both cases, the agent was left to sign on behalf of the seller. In both cases, the agent was to confer with a relative and get confirmation before they went ahead with the deal. And in both cases, that's exactly what the agents did. They followed their seller's express instructions. Well, you can guess what happened. In both cases, when the sellers came back, they looked at it and they said, I'm not happy to sell at this price. I'm not going to go ahead and close the transaction. And their argument was, that's not my signature on the document. Now, in the first case, one where we had the written express instruction, they just flat out refused to close. In the second case, the seller delayed for a couple of months, closed. As a result, the buyer sued the seller for a shortfall because of the damages he incurred because of the delay, and the seller refused to pay the commission, and that's in the courts. But in both cases, it had an unhappy ending. And I'll tell you something even more surprising. In the first case, the seller who said, just sign on my behalf, after the whole thing caused a problem, caused a rift within their family, the agent wanted to, the seller wanted to relist with the agent refused. They decided to list with somebody else in the office. They sent the exact same instructions the second time, I'll be out of the country, just sign on my behalf. And so you end up in a real problem because you step in, you've got a vested interest in the transaction. I get that. You want to be able to put it together. I get that. But you leave yourself in a very vulnerable position when you do this if the seller doesn't follow through. And you always got to ask yourself, anytime any of your actions are a little bit out of the mainstream of what we normally do, you need to say, what happens if this thing goes south? What happens if it goes before the courts? Can I explain and justify what I've done in my position? Sometime prior to our electronic transfer, we had a situation, or we would have a situation, where the buyer was, say, unavailable, and the buyer would say to the agent, would you buy on my behalf, just buy in trust? And the agent had confidence in the buyer, and so the agent would draft up the offer. This was back when deposits were $500 or $1,000. The agent would put up the $500 or $1,000, put their name in it in trust. It's a legal document. They can do that. But understand, if the buyer doesn't follow through, you as the agent are buying the property. And we saw that happen from time to time. You got to be very careful about that when you're buying in trust. If, going back to the first example, if you're going to be in a situation where the seller is saying to you, I'm out of the country, sign on my behalf, get a written power of attorney. Now, I want to caution you, be very careful about power of attorneys. We have power of attorney forms, and you can create them. There's some certain things that are required. It takes 2 witnesses and so on. But it's difficult to put away a power of attorney once it's in place. So I would give you 2 cautionary pieces of advice. First of all, have the power of attorney, the signator, be somebody other than you. And secondly, make the power of attorney specific to a property and limited to a certain period of time after which it expires. So that's the best thing to do there. Now, another problem that we've had over the years, especially back when deposits were $500 or $1,000, is where the agent would put up the money. They would say, well, the buyer isn't right in the area, and it's difficult for them to get me the money, and so I will put up the $500 or I'll put up the $1,000. Understand that that gives a certain amount of security to the seller, because if the deal becomes firm and then they fail to close, they can get the deposit. They have to get a quarter to do it, but they can do it. But the buyer has no skin in the game. It's not their $500, it's not their $1,000. Recently, we had a situation where the offer called for a $15,000 deposit, and the brokerage put up the money. And remarkable. And then the brokerage was having problems finding their buyer. In the meantime, the offer called for a further $15,000 deposit, and the brokerage was prepared to do that too. All of a sudden, they kind of came to their senses, found the buyer, got a mutual release. Now, understand that on the agreement of purchase and sale, it's between the buyer and the seller, and it looks like the deposit is put up by the buyer. So the deposit would normally go back to the buyer. While they got the buyer to sign, the seller to sign, the seller agreed to sign a mutual release, even though it was a firm deal, and the money was directed back to the brokerage. They came out unscathed. They were very, very fortunate. But you got to be extremely careful when you step into the shoes of your client. Be careful doing that. Do everything you can to help your client, to facilitate the transaction, to do what you can legally and honestly, but be very, very careful about the liability that you occur when you decide that you're going to put up the deposit, sign on their behalf. These kind of things put you in jeopardy and can cause the whole thing to go to court. So you want to always ask yourself in these kind of situations, what happens if it does go to court? Can I explain my situation? Is everything I've done absolutely legally supportable in court? Or if it's marginal, if it's questionable, if I'm putting myself in a vulnerable position, folks, don't do it. Hope that makes sense. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. Talk to you again next week.